Hi everyone, and welcome to the February edition of Writing Arborist Reports. My name's Peter Gray, and this session will be presented by Mark Hartley. In this session, we will be looking at the suitability of tree species for planting in the urban environment.
Okay, guys. Well, the first thing I thought we'd look at tonight was how do we know, or what do we do to get an idea of how a tree is going to be responding to the things we're doing around it, or the question of how tolerant is the tree, or how tolerant is the species. And I think there's some indicators that will assist us with that, some general concepts and ideas. I also think there needs to be some definition in terms of what we're talking about. So what might be minor to one species or genera might be significant to another, and vice versa, and it might cross over. So I guess the first thing is, what are we talking about when we're talking about impact? If we're talking about cutting roots, which I think is probably the most, then we've got to think about things other than just the species. So, and we've also got to think about how close we're cutting. So let's think about some of those bits and pieces. Firstly, a gentleman called Tony Rodd, a botanist, very clever man, proposed a concept about suitability of street trees based on their tolerance of damage, or tolerance to damage, or their tolerance to inhospitable environments. Tony's thoughts were riparian rainforest species are some of the most tolerant to urbanization. Who's found that experience, or at least certainly from wet sclerophyll up to rainforest and riparian species? So things like callistemons, leuphostomans, Eucalyptus microcories, you know, the range of trees that come from those sort of environments. Tristaniopsis lorena, melaleucas, callistemons, those sort of trees. Anyone found that to be the case?
Yep.
So I thought it was an interesting concept, and it took me a while. And it's one of the things that I've questioned is why. And I think it's because they're a species that, or the trees that grow in those environments, grow in situations where things can come to a stop. So riparian species, it gets dry on the floodplains. Even though it gets wet, it gets dry. And when it gets wet, interestingly enough, for many of those species, they may not necessarily have a different metabolic pathway. So a lot of them gate the membrane protein called aquaporin that takes in water through the roots. They gate it off and stop water from coming in. So again, even during wet periods, they can be suffering from the same dry process. And if you think about a rainforest, hard to believe, but rainforests, the soils reach saturation point regularly. And so if it's a species that gates off this water uptake, then even though it's wet, it's actually functioning from a water absorption point of view as though it's dry. So I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why those species do well. That is, they're tolerant of no water uptake and tolerant of high levels of water uptake. So when water is available, they're very good at exploiting it. And so I think that's one. And that's one.
Quick interruption.
Yep, go ahead.
One of the things I've noticed in Melbourne with the leuphostomans is that on a hot day they'll wilt.
Yes.
And I suspect that the stoma closed down.
I think you're probably right, Rob. And I think that when you're getting down to Melbourne, when you're getting down to those 600s and 500 mil years, you really are pushing it to well and truly the limit for the species. And I think, you know, we've got to be aware that there are limits. But what would have happened, let's say we got that same sort of effect on a construction site, what would you do to deal with it? And, you know, I get asked this question by arborists. I get asked this question by council arborists, you know, okay, you talk about transplanting, but let's be realistic. You do a lot of aftercare for transplanting. And my answer is yes, I do. I use mulch. I can amend the soil solute levels, and I use a chemical to stimulate roots. And I have a permit to do it, and I can tell you how to get the permit. This year, that chemical, unfortunately, has already killed 7 people. So you've got to use it with some degree of caution and care. But that chemical is called water. And water is a phenomenal stimulant of root development. And so, you know, we talk about cutting roots. When we talk about this within the standard, one of the things the standard is absolutely silent on is management and aftercare. And that's where we need to bring our expertise to bear. We need to say, look, this species will tolerate moderate moisture levels or high moisture levels or low moisture levels, and then we can stimulate root development by adding water. And so I think we've got to keep the benefits of irrigation in mind. The other thing is the little parts of roots that take up water, absorbing roots. These are not the very end, but the very end bar one bit. The very end is a pioneer root. It's pioneering new soil or repioneering soil. And then behind that, you get this zone of maturation where you get root hairs develop, and those roots are absorbing water for maybe 6 or 8 weeks, and then they're starting to get to the stage where they start to lignify. We start to get proper bark development, proper suberin, suberized layer. And at that point in time, even though they might only be 0.5 millimeter or 1 millimeter in diameter, they're no longer effectively absorbing. And so the phrase I use is that the absorbing roots are highly ephemeral. I mean, leaves are ephemeral, you know, deciduous trees, they'll be around for 9 months of the year, but on roots, 6 or 8 weeks is not an uncommon sort of length of duration. There's exceptions to the rule. The first major exception is mycorrhizal roots, particularly roots that have an ectomycorrhizal association, and some of our Myrtaceae fit into that category. And those roots will go for a year or more because of that interrelationship. Again, to stimulate mycorrhizal roots or stimulate new absorbing roots, water, number one stimulant, of course, followed by temperature. And depending on the species and the environment, that's going to vary. For me, in this sort of temperate area of Sydney, Melbourne's not too much different. Soil temperatures of about 16 degrees. We'll see root development start. You increase the soil temperature, of course, you get faster root development. And we know that from propagation. Anyone from a horticultural background at all? Danny grew pot, and so did David and Vicky. Oh, all of you. Okay. So yeah, bottom heat was exactly about that process, is how do I stimulate root development? So water and heat. And in fact, I consulted on a project in Germany a number of years back, and that was one of the things is, you know, how do we get more rapid root development? And I said, well, why don't we stimulate root growth during winter? What we have to do is put it in some heating coils, and we can start to go through that process of regenerating new roots. And indeed, absorbing roots do grow during winter. It's one of the things that I thought it made sense that a tree is able to absorb small amounts of water even during winter. I posed the question to Alex Shigo, and he made me go out in the middle of the bush, in the middle of the snow, and dig until I found absorbing roots. And then the next question he asked me, a tree like that in sort of diameter, he said, what sort of tree was it? And I scratched my head and I thought, it's deciduous, and all I've got's buds, and I have no idea. And I sat and I thought about it, and I thought, it's a hibiscus. So it gives you an idea again of this contrast of how big we think trees get. Trees are indeterminate, that is, they keep on growing and growing and growing. Human beings, most animals are determinate. In fact, pretty well all animals are determinate. We get to a threshold and then we stop. So I think we've got to look at tolerance in the context of what we can do for treatment as well, but that's a separate deal. So riparian rainforest, and if you think about that, trees in areas where you get soil saturation aren't too different than trees that are in riparian areas. So anything in plain areas, flat zones. And so the Cumberland Plains, for example, has Eucalyptus teraticornis, Eucalyptus mollicana, Eucalyptus cribra, Eugenioides. I don't know how Eugenioides would go, but certainly the first three fairly tolerant of root damage. Then you get something like Eucalyptus grandis. Again, it's that wet sclerophyll forest. And Daniel Austin, who's on line, wave your hand, Danny, so everyone can see you. Danny has one in her council area that the council engineering team decided to prune the roots of on the roadside with a stump grinder, as they do, right up to the trunk. And that wasn't bad enough. The footpath guys noticed the roots were lifting on the other side, so they did the footpath, and then the gas company realized that they had a leak, so they cut the third side, and that tree has gone through 2 microbursts and is still standing upright and growing moderately well. Now, grandis doesn't do well, again, with lower rainfall. So once you start putting it out into the Melbourne zone or into the western suburbs of Sydney, it's marginal in terms of needing more moisture longer term.
Mark, can I interrupt for just a quick second?
It.
I was just wondering, so Lophostomen and confertus known pretty well for tolerance. I don't have a whole lot of personal experience myself, but I certainly know a few arborists around the Melbourne area that would say that it's not that tolerant of root disturbance, quite tolerant of urban environment and poor soils, but root disturbance not so much.
And I think that's exactly right, Reece, because of that comment that I made earlier, and that is you've got a species that would prefer higher moisture levels, and you're already running it probably somewhere between a half to a third, depending on the rainfall for the year, of what it's well adapted to. So you've got to put that moisture tolerance and that tolerance of root loss. So the function of roots are twofold. One, structural, and we don't want trees falling over. The other one is the uptake of water, and the component that's taking it up is small. So if there's sufficient uptake of water in the remaining section, then the tolerance is moderately high to high. So that's where I said I'd go back to that situation in Lophostomen in western suburbs of Sydney, or in Melbourne, where our rainfall is not too dissimilar. And I'd start saying, look, if you're prepared to irrigate the remaining portion of the root system, give it about 6 or 8 weeks to stimulate some new absorbing roots. What you do on the side that you're going to cut is probably nowhere near as critical.
Yeah,
so
okay.
It's a balancing act between what it wants for water and then stimulation of new roots. And Benson, in his paper, and those of you who don't have it, Peter, I think it's on the thing, but if it's not, Benson did the 12 times trunk diameter calculation and showed that at 12 times trunk diameter, cutting roots does have a impact on the physiology of the tree. And when I questioned him about it as to what sort of maintenance or undertaking or care, the answer was 0. So if you do 0 care and you cut it 12 times trunk diameter, we have a perceivable impact. That's very different than if we had, for example, done some irrigation just a few weeks beforehand, closer into the tree, and had done the same thing. We actually may have achieved the opposite results. And we see that really in the extreme when you start talking about things like ficus, where, simply using the word water is enough to start stimulating root development. Humidity gets them going. They stimulate incredibly well. And I think I mentioned last class, Susan Street, in Auburn, there's a school and a car park beside. Drive yourself to the top of the car park, look over the edge of the fig tree, and you'll see it's got nowadays 100% canopy. We cut roots at 2 times trunk diameter from the base of that. That's pretty close. The tree at that stage had 50% canopy. There were pushes to have it removed, but it's a heritage tree and it wasn't the council. And council were building the car park. So they adopted for an alternate policy, and their alternate policy was capture some of the car park water, put it into a tank below the car park, 1.5 stories, 2 stories below ground, and then irrigate the tree. And it's gone from strength to strength to strength because we've simply stimulated new absorbing roots. The other thing that we've done is we've mulched. And, there were 2 management techniques that really arboriculture needs to consider. It's management of soil moisture and the application of organic material. And of course, that's one of the things we want in a construction site. It doesn't always work that way. So I've given you those trees as being tolerant of root cutting, but I take the point very much, Reese, that if you put a Melaleuca quinquenervia out in Broken Hill and you cut the roots, its tolerance is nowhere near the same as when you put it in, let's go Lismore at the moment, it's nice and moist, northern beaches, northern rivers, sorry, you'll find that where the rainfall's higher, they're far more tolerant. And a part of that explanation is they're also getting more stimulation.
Is the value of sea salt as high as it's purported to be?
Oh, that's a horrible question to ask. If I was going to buy products like N-acetic acid, naphtha acid, I'd buy them in a concentrated form. But the real value of sea salt is that people use it, people are comfortable with it, people are interacting with the tree, and you can't stuff it up. You understand that hormones are hormones, and a little of something is different than a lot of something. So in the early days, we used to have lots of rooting hormones available readily available in agricultural supplies and regularly misapplied. And at high levels, it's equally as problematic as it is, giving us men too much testosterone or too much estrogen, unless you're going to go through some form of change in your gender orientation, or you want to have small gonads. Either of those are a consequence for males anyhow. So I think we've got to put that in the context of, yes, if I can get someone to apply sea salt and that makes them happy and they're prepared to commit to that, they're at least looking at the tree, touching the tree, watering, being aware. And I think we make trees, from an arborist perspective, we make trees something that are not desirable to have rather than trying to make them things that are desirable to have. So if somebody gets a kick out of being out there and watering, 2 litres of one of the most expensive naturally derived hormones on the market, then that's great. If I was looking at it from a reality point of view, we know that, for example, the rooting hormones are of almost no benefit to no benefit on palms. And there's some evidence that they're not significantly, whilst we get root elongation, we're not necessarily increasing efficacy of the rooting system. So if I was to look at doing something, the water's probably 2/3 the value of sea salt being applied. Is that a fair enough answer? And that's not saying I don't.
Yeah, no, it sounds fair. That was going to be my next question. Is it actually just the value of watering the plant as opposed to the sea salts being put in it? So yeah, no, it sounds fair.
On a construction site, I have a silly view that if I can get the client to at least periodically irrigate, particularly during warm periods, dry periods, I'm 2/3 through the battle. And when I'm saying irrigating, I'm not talking about setting in a micro drip system or micro spray system. If I can get a micro pore hose, those black recycled rubber ones, or one of those green ones with the horrible spikes, I don't care which one it is, and I can get them to get extra water on, the net results are phenomenal in comparison. That's simply because we're stimulating the remaining portion of the root system. And one of the things that happens when you cut roots is you send a whole pile of hormonal responses into chaos, and the tree has to develop new roots. And the roots that it has to develop aren't woody ones, they're the absorbing ones. And it's only when the absorbing roots start to take up enough water to stimulate top growth do we then get that lovely little seesawing of growth. In 2011, during his lecture, Kim Coda in Parramatta pointed out that about 80% of all plant growth is regulated by water. It's a pretty important chemical. And he describes it as the chemical that's in greatest shortage in soil. So it's the most limiting factor generally on tree growth. Now, that's true probably until you get to around about Cairns, and that might start to fluctuate back away where you start to get 2,400 mils or more of rainfall. But I think for most of us in most temperate zones, and even most subtropical zones, water is a major issue. unless you're in one of those really wonderful, super wet areas. If you look at America, America has the same sort of issues down the West Coast until you get up to the Pacific Northwest, and then things sort of change. And then the Appalachians feed a fair bit. You get a little bit of tropical rainfall down the bottom side. You get into the Gulf, and again, there are areas there where it's just horrendous. And of course, when you get inland, it's the same as when you get inland in Australia. Very different again. So that raises the next one. You're gone.
Sorry, quick question. On cutting roots, and as soon as you cut them, putting mulch and water stimulating root growth, would I be correct in saying that increasing root growth at the time of being cut and stimulating new cell growth would reduce decay within those cut areas?
Question. The evidence is conclusive that roots are better at defending themselves. And I suspect, Luke, that's because they've got a lot more parenchyma than the above ground portion of the tree. And they've also got less lignin, less cellulose, so they're less rich, but they are more porous. I mean, the size of as you've seen, the size of the vessels or the tracheids and the roots bigger than above ground, particularly the vessels, just become prolific in angiosperms. So I suspect that it's more to do with the fact that living cells that can defend. And a good way to think about this, what sort of car are you driving now?
MUX still.
Okay. Yeah, nice little car. So I'm going to put a couple of kilograms of chicken on your back seat, and I'm going to put a chicken on my back seat, wind down the windows a bit in both so that it doesn't get too hot. And we'll come back in a month's time, and I reckon my car will be worth a lot more than your car. And that's because when things are dead, it's hard to defend yourself. But when you're alive, you can. So the parenchyma is able to set up a whole pile of chemical responses to defend itself. One of the things it does really well is it tyloses. And tylosis, for those of you who've never seen it, and you can watch it happening in a root by just cutting through a root on something like a eucalyptus and putting it under a microscope for a few hours and just watching and monitoring. Cut about 50 mil length or so, and you'll see the vessels start to fill up with the cell wall of the adjacent parenchyma, and they'll stop it. So once they do that, once the parenchyma is dead, I suspect that what they do next, Luke, and the research hasn't been done, but it makes sense, is they suberize that cellulose cell wall as well. In other words, as a part of the sacrificial process, they make a zone that makes it very hard to penetrate. So I think it's active defense, not passive defense.
Yeah.
That is, the living cells are doing their best to defend. The other thing to keep in mind is, whilst we see the soil is full of fungi, and I think we could all agree with that, yeah? Most of that fungi is good. The vast majority of fungi in the soil is beneficial. And there is a benefit for them in looking after the tree. And I'm anthropomorphizing them. They're not sitting there emotively saying, oh, that's a nice root, let's look after it. But biochemically, it's certainly the stimulation. And we see that with things like trees that are mulched are more resistant to Phytophthora. Trees that are mulched have fewer antagonistic fungi come in. Some of the fungi even protect against, like, for example, oyster fungi. You've all seen that down at Coles or Woolworths and probably had it in food. That's a nematode eating fungi. So it'll set out little lassos of hyphae that catch and kill and allow them to consume nematodes. And whilst they're good nematodes, they're also bad nematodes. So it's a part of the balancing process. And Shigo is very clear on it, and I have supported it since, and that is we really need to understand that trees are, most of our trees are fungally based organisms, and they live in a part of a community. And so adding mulch back in, putting logs back in, I know it drives people crazy to think, there's a log in my front yard that's been eaten by termites and wood roaches and all sorts of other organisms, but that's the ecosystem that trees are best adapted to. So getting back to tolerance then, Next one is what about trees that are well tolerated to incredibly dry conditions? Things like Brachychiton rupestris. Well, we know that, as long as it's brown side down and green side up, that plant will almost tolerate anything. I had one here in a pot for almost 16 years, and it never got anything else but natural rainfall. And it continued to survive. We put it in the garden about 6-7 years ago, and it's going crazy now. So yes, here's the dilemma. Plants that are good in dry regions often have trouble with elevated moisture levels. So we've got to weigh that up where we are. Same with trees that are adapted to shallow sandstone or rock-based soils, even the heaths, tolerate of a lot of root damage, but don't tolerate necessarily getting wet, depending on the species again. We're talking about Erica, well, they don't care. We're talking about, some of our Proteaceae, they don't want to get flooded. So you've got to weigh that up in the equation. What sort of tree is it? Where's it grown naturally? What's it tolerate? And what's the range of it? One of the trees that does perform well in the West here, and I know it performs satisfactorily in Melbourne because I was down there last week, and that's Angophora costata. And you think about where Angophora grows. Well, it grows on the shallow sandstone soils of the escarpments around Sydney, and it also grows in incredibly deep, rich alluvial soils of Kringai area, for example. So you get a tree that's very broad thing. So that's a tree I'd expect to take a fair amount of a beating. The next thing that I would look at in terms of as an indicator is how many first order lateral roots. And that sounds like a real dumb thing. But there's work done by Marks and others that show that trees that have 7 or more first order lateral roots do better for themselves. So trees that have got 12 and 15 first order lateral roots do even better. And that goes back to some of this question of what is vigor? And vigor is that genetic propensity to perform well. So things like camphor laurel probably has 30 or 40 first order lateral roots. And I'm absolutely convinced, and I can show you the images, lots of them, you can take camphor laurel and cut to the trunk regularly and reliably, and it says, okay, that was not nice, but I'll deal with that. I know you can cut 2 sides to the trunk. Gordon Mann did it in Redwood City, and he said, they started to get a little bit moody, a little bit of dieback. 3 sides, you get a moderate amount of dieback, and 4 sides, they fall over. And so I think, the more times that you've got, the more roots you've got, the greater the capacity of the tree to exploit the environment. And the more that it can exploit the environment, then again, the greater the vigor again. So I think that's a combination thing there.
People have an experience with liquid amber. Surely that has a lot of lateral roots as well, I would suspect.
It's not as many as you think, Reese, because it's riparian. It likes to have its roots very close to the surface, horribly. And so as you get deeper, you don't get a lot of roots. But if you cut, so let's talk liquid amber, let's talk that whole group, and that is deciduous trees. What you do to a deciduous tree during winter is different than what we do to a deciduous tree during summer. And so, again, the standard is silent on timing of things. It's one of the things that will be included in the revision as one of those 3.3.4 items, things you need to consider. And that's timing, when you're going to do it. And Mick Rogers used to give a great presentation on cutting platanus roots. There's a tree that's got a lot of first order lateral roots. It's a very vigorous species in general. Up at the Richmond campus out here, there's a couple there with, or at least one there with Phytophora, and it continues to fight off the Phytophora and say, well, I'm stronger than you. And he cuts first order lateral roots in winter to almost no detectable impact. That's very different than cutting at midsummer. And interestingly, the converse is true on palms. Palms prefer to be cut during the warmer months than they do in the cooler months. And that is because they can regenerate roots a lot quicker. They're an evergreen, and they're essentially a C4 photosynthesizer. So sunlight and water is their friend. So timing of things can have a huge impact. And it gets difficult when you get a site where you've got multiple different species. And I don't know what people's experiences are with liquid ambers, but they're not one of my favorite trees. So it's not one of the trees that I'd cherish and put in a high priority. If it was 3 or 4 times trunk diameter from the building, I'd probably be saying, look, maybe you should think about removing it. And that's just, we've got poor genetic material in Australia in general. There are some new cultivars that are around. Oakville's one that I know of. It's just, having seen the source or the parent tree, it's spectacular to look at. And, it's the sort of tree that you'd love to have. Whereas the average liquid amber I see hits the age of about 35 or 40 and it's starting to look really poor. It's genetically, its side branches want to take over and come up the top, and they'll do that at the expense of adding taper. And then you get this massive slenderness ratio issue and branches fail. So
have a lot of roots, but I wouldn't have described them as tolerant to root damage either. So
I wouldn't describe them as tolerant. I mean, they'll tolerate it, but it's not something that's rocket proof. But talk about a dry region tree that is deciduous. You talk about crepe myrtle, Lagostroma indica, and again, it's almost at that level of what do you do to destroy it? Plumeria fits in that same category. You can do things to plumeria that you wouldn't do to most trees. But interestingly enough, if you're cutting roots on plumeria, you've got to leave it exposed and you've got to let it dry out for a period of time, because there's one that doesn't like getting moisture on the roots. And that if you've cut it or grown it from cuttings, the same thing again, it likes to ripen off before you put it in the soil and start to propagate.
On liquid amber, I've often thought, are we taking our science from looking at street trees and seeing roots in areas of high compaction where we put them in a box and just go, they're a crap tree, they've got surface roots, but we're planting them in places that they're not meant to, where if they were in a sandier soil where there was air, moisture, nutrients below, they wouldn't have to have their roots on the surface, and would they be a problem?
That's a good question, Luke. I don't know the answer. I have seen them growing in really good, high quality growing soils. So, your good loams and things like that. And they still tend to have a surface root system.
Okay.
It's just the way that it is as a species. I mean, it is riparian, but just different than a lot of other riparian. So again, these are good brush strokes, broad strokes, but they've got to be dealt with specifically. And I think, I think it was Vicky that asked this question, how do we know how a tree is going to perform? And ultimately, one of the best ways is a camera. And I say that, the pictures I've got of Arboriculture when they did the Manly Corso upgrade in 1987, when they cut 1 times trunk diameter away on half the circumference, I would look at it and say, wow, you can't do that. In fact, I took photographs of them because the other arborists that I was with at the time said they're going to die. And you learn from that. You learn from doing things that part of the dilemma for us in arboriculture is we want to bury or hide any chance of us being wrong. So we say, I don't think that tree is going to survive. We'll just cut it down. We won't keep the tree, let it die and say, we're right. It's the same if we think the tree is dangerous, we have to cut it down. We won't say, this tree is dangerous, let's fence it off and wait 20 years to see what does happen. And that's why I say, look, if you want to start looking at likelihood of failure, you have to go out into places like the bush to find trees that haven't been sterilized by our need to have zero or extremely low risks.
Yeah, I understand. Like what you've said before, you said like trees don't have carrots, and then you've seen trees with carrots. I've seen trees with carrots like that. What kids draw, and like when you've got air, soil, water, and nutrients, that's where the roots are going to be. And if on a sandy soil, it's not going to be in that top 200, more likely compared to a shallow base sort of silty clay or something compacted on the side. And I think we tend to sort of put things in a box a little bit and just go, this is the one all answer, but I don't think it is. There's, as I said, there's weather, there's climate, there's tree type, lots of things that they all contribute.
Absolutely. And for the correction, I've never said trees don't have carrots.
No, sorry, but yeah, you said they do, but yeah.
Starts with a carrot. Every tree
People
starts
say they don't.
A taproot. The radical is a taproot, and that's why we find it hard to pull out a young privet or a young camphor laurel, is because it's got a single root that we pull out. Now, this root is in tension, and wood is incredibly strong in tension, so that's why we find pulling these roots out. And often they break off quite low, where the diameter is quite small, because wood, on average, lignified tissue in tension is about the same as wire per square surface area. Of course, I said to you there's lots of holes in roots. So if you're talking about a 6 mil root, you really got something that's probably got 2.5 or 2 mils or 1 mil of diameter. So you're pulling on a pretty solid piece of wire going down, and it will break at a join or where there's a junction. Because when you get a junction, you get bending. When you get bending, you get breakage. So you're absolutely right. You see that here in Sydney. I'm not familiar, guys, sorry, in Melbourne. Kelly, in your end of the world, you see it along the river. You grow ficus out here in the western suburbs, you'll see the surface roots. Anywhere from on the Cumberland Plains, where you get clay soils, you'll see the surface roots. Go into the eastern suburbs, and the roots are a lot deeper. So there's no questions. You'll see the same thing with eucalypts. Many of you looked at eucs and said, I've never really seen the basal swell on a eucalypt like I'd expect. And part of the reason why is they actually have their roots go down at an angle out from a very early stage. So those first order laterals are like this. Whereas you look at a liquid amber, their first order laterals tend to want to be more horizontal, just genetically. But I take your point, and I don't know what it'd be like if you grew them on a really sandy soil. I can't think of any off the top of my head, but it wouldn't take long to drive around the eastern suburbs or the northern beaches, and you'd have a fairly good data set to answer that. And again, Reese, I don't know what. Oh well, yeah, you're at Albury, Wodonga, aren't you?
Yep.
So along the river, along that riparian zone, very different. You see that along the riparian zone, by the way, look, with Camaldulensis down on the river there at Albury, this multi-layer oftentimes root, and sometimes single roots that are almost trunk-like.
And you can certainly see it as the banks get washed away, it just keeps going down and down and down. I'm conscious of asking too many questions and stealing all the limelight. I've got one more for you though. Discussing these many tree species that are actually surprisingly incredibly tolerant of root damage, do you think that the Australian standard is actually overly conservative? And is that going to change?
Okay, the answer is yes, no. Conservative. No, it won't change because we're comfortable with 12 times trunk diameter as the starting point. I think what we're going to make clearer from the standards side is that is the starting point. If you have a 10% or a minor encroachment, then really there's no need for an arborist. You just need to protect the zone and you're done. And that could be done by an architect, builder, hell, even a landscape architect could get into that category. But after that, it really does require some thought. Now, the Australian standard is based off the American and the British standard. The American standard comes from the earlier British standard, and the earlier British standard had 6, 8, I'm going to go 10, and then 15 times trunk diameter, depending on how old the tree was and all these variables. When it went to, so 10 was a sensible point for most trees. Young, healthy, vigorous trees, 6 times has no impact on them whatsoever, and same process. So, but at 10 times it got to America, and the Americans said, yep, 1 inch, 10 inches, 2 inches, 20 inches. Oh, that's 1 foot 8 inch. They said, this is too hard. Let's just go from 1 inch to 12 inches. And so we increased the tree protection zone by 44%. to deal with mathematical incompetence by the Americans due to their failure to understand the importance of metricizing their system. And so that is the reason we did that. And I think if you understand that and put it in context, is realistically what the stand says is, if the tree is important and it's got to be kept, arboricultural input makes sense. Now, you and I both know that if I put a tree into an enclosure zone that's, let's say, 9 meters by 9 meters, it's a lovely protection zone, and I draw it on the plan, and I show it, and I put a load sharing surface past it and mulch it, and maybe even some stem protection if we've got something else going on in that zone at some stage. But all that stuff in place. When I get there, I'm going to find 3 fence panels on average. 4 means it's a good site. 2 means they're creative. It's generally not what we specify. And there's a reason for that. And I take it the other side, and that is builders have long since learnt that we're a pack of, I can't say that word because it's being recorded, but we're a pack of liars or incompetent, because they already know that they can probably do half the things we've said they can't do and get away with it. Doesn't mean it's good, but it means that we've educated them incorrectly. We've said to them, look, rather than saying we're doing this as a precautionary action, we sort of come off with if you don't do this, the tree's going to die. And of course, the tree doesn't die. And some of those builders have been around for 30 years, and they're going back and looking at the sites they did 30 years ago and saying, that tree's still there. Now, that arborist wasn't worth paying. I paid him good money back in those days. So I think we've got to balance those two things up. I think the role of an arborist is, I think the Australian standard says that you're not worth paying as an arborist unless you can have a major encroachment. Okay.
Yeah.
And so the role of an arborist is to figure out how to have major encroachments, retain the tree in a healthy and stable condition, not just for the short term, but for the longer term. And that's certainly possible and doable. And we've seen some great examples. Again, those of you who are in Sydney, if you want to go up to the Lane Cove development area north of Epping Road, where the unit blocks went in, that Blue Gum High Forest area, some amazing trees. Now, they were a lot smaller when they were building there, but be aware that a lot of those were left there and built around quite successfully. So I think there's a balancing act there. The other thing to keep in mind that whilst I say it's overdone, I mean, a transplant is typically 5 times trunk diameter. A sensitive species might be 6. Rarely, really rarely will you get 8, because 8 times radius, because the cost just starts to become ridiculous because of the mass of soil. Sensitive, really tolerant species, melaleucas, callistemons, eucalyptus, ficus, 3 times trunk diameter is not uncommon. And they're moved and do well for themselves. There's certainly a setback period for several years, but that's got to be weighed up in that equation. I wouldn't suggest that most development is as bad as transplanting. I look at transplanting as probably being the last option of tree protection, not the first option.
Yep.
Have with that. So I think that number of first order lateral roots is probably some good indicator. I also think the amount of parenchyma in the roots gives you some indicator. So ficus has a fairly good amount of parenchyma. Brachychiton has a fairly good amount of parenchyma. Brachychiton also has, and I mentioned this the other day, one of the early ones, is it's one of those trees that preferentially produces a cortex or a taproot, or several taproots. And so its reliance on the lateral root system is not as important. And that's what made bottle tree transplanting such a popular thing there. And now has been banned. We're going in and ripping them out of the wild there for a few years and sending them all around the world. And that is, when you've got a good downward root system, easy to get away with. And you see that with other woody plants with what we call these caduciformed or big cortex type root system, things like Bocania, the ponytail palm, again, what you're seeing, that big rounded bit, is actually the root system pushing itself out of the ground. You want them to grow faster, bury them up to the trunk again, and that'll get you a faster growth rate. And then when you're ready, expose half of it, rip off all those small little roots that come off it, and you get there in half the time. So horticultural trickery. So I think that sort of gives you a broad range of where I'd be at now. I think, Peter, we put Hamilton's paper up on the
yeah, I think so. Yeah.
Yep. Okay. So I mean, he says essentially 3 times trunk diameter from most healthy trees on one side is not the end of the world. Now that's pretty close. And I'm not saying again that you'd want to do that, but again, it's how you manage that in the context of the overall process. So I would say the things that we can do as an arborist in that is, that's what we're going to do while the tree goes. I'd rather see the tree stay. And I worry that 12 times trunk diameter, and I've certainly seen it used that way as a tool to get rid of trees. We want to build here, and we're going to only be 5 times or 6 times trunk diameter away from the tree. Want to get rid of it. It's the same. I've been called out to do a number of transplants where the palm is 3 meters, Phoenix palm, 3 meters from the building. And the householder says to me, well, the standard says I've got to be 4, and the arborist says I'm going to be too close to the tree, so I've got to move it. And I said, yep, that makes perfectly good sense. I'm going to cut it at 2.1 meters in diameter all the way across, so 1.05 diameter, so that you don't damage it when you cut it 3 meters in diameter. And that's just dumb. And that's just failing to put the head into gear properly.
What about the structural root zone, Mark? The standard is kind of silent on whether or not you can encroach into the structural root zone. It describes it and says that it's important to keep the tree up. It doesn't say when and where and how you can encroach.
Okay. The structure, it's interesting because Matt races on this and then completely sidesteps it and comes up with an equation based on one model only. The trees that have sinker roots or heart rooting, those that have more vertical root systems, the structural root zone becomes less and less reliable in terms of its measurement. I think it's probably most relevant for liquid amber. If I were to pick the tree that I see as being in that category of something with a fairly surface rooted system, that would be it. Now, again, Luke, I take the point that it may be performing very differently in loamy soils.
Eucalyptus Nicolai, maybe. I've certainly seen plenty of those wind thrown. I don't know how.
I think that is a problem with white rots in the root. And I think it's just that Nicolai, for whatever reason, is not very good at compartmentalizing, particularly in wall 1. It just seems to run through, and you get these long, big strip cankers and long wounds. But yes, I would be cautious around a Nicolai in every regard for that reason. Then the next question I'd say, Reese, is this a tree that we really should be playing with? And I'm working on a site at the moment where the council is insisting that the tree be maintained and the site be decontaminated by reducing the soil levels down by 600 mils. I'm saying I'm wiping my hands of any liability. I don't want to work that one. The soil's got to go out and get replaced. And even though that's cyclical, you damage roots when you go for things. And let's talk about that one very quickly. When we're doing root exploration and we're using water or air, usually we're damaging the roots. We're damaging the roots because plants cells have a turgid pressure of about 120 to 130 psi, or 1 megapascal, just under a megapascal, about 8 to 900 megapascals. So you start stripping off the bark once you get up to that 130 psi. Well, a standard compressor is putting out at 120 psi, but when you start putting it through a very small nozzle, you accelerate the speed and therefore you accelerate the pressure, and so you create more damage. And water is even worse. We use 10,000 psi and a 000 tip will cut through a Washingtonia robusta trunk in probably a minute and a half. So that stuff just cuts. in good loamy soils and good sandy loam soils, you can crank your pressure down, move your tip back, and they work beautifully. And you can do a great job. As soon as you get into heavier soils, to dislodge the soil particles, it becomes more and more problematic. So that would be my general guideline, and nothing, Vicky, as valuable as looking around for examples. Going back into Google Street View now gives us stuff that's already 10 years old, and I'm amazed at what you can find in just looking around for examples of, where digging has occurred, something's been going on in the area, development's occurred that's 10 years old, and you can see what actually happened by ducking along on Street View and then going back and looking at now. And I think trees survive more in spite of us than because of us. And again, amongst the consultants here, I know David and I have discussed this on the forum once before, but I would say 9 out of 10 sites that I do a tree protection plan for fail to have regular inspections done and probably fail to implement the tree protection plan as discussed from probably day one. Every now and again, I get a really good client. And as I said, my moderate ones, and there's one crowd that we deal with in the Southern Shire that just, the project manager says to me every time I'm out there, I'll put water on this week. And I sit there and think, well, okay, we're big strides ahead, because there are other places I go. And I can think of a transplant that I did in Ashfield, a cedar, so that they could do the, and the council said to them after about 9 months or so, you need to call Mark, something's wrong with the tree. I got out there and the tree was almost dead. And I said to them, can I just ask some simple questions? Why is there concrete around the base of the tree? They said the cars were getting bogged. I said, but what happened to the fence that we put around and the mulch and the irrigation system? We had to turn it off because the cars were getting bogged. And that was their understanding of what was appropriate management for something they'd already spent. And this is going back more than a decade. They spent $36,000 moving the tree and then promptly tried to do their best to kill it. And I think that is something that we deal with. And, I spend a lot of time and effort in my reports, both in the body and in the appendix, trying to communicate what I want by giving photographs, by making it educational in terms of whoever's reading it. And in spite of all of that, I'm pretty sure that 9 out of 10 times it's not even read by the site personnel at all. And I'd say it's probably going to be silly, but probably 1 time out of 10 it's not even read by the council. The council's already gone in with, in their mind, they've gone out and looked at things and they said, yeah, that's what we're going to approve, and that's not what we're going to approve. And they don't read through it in detail.
With a bit of levity, I kind of say, when I'm consulting on jobs like that, with my 12 years of experience, it really comes down to put a bit of mulch on it and water it and it'll be fine. And there are many of you here with many, many more years experience. It must be so frustrating to walk into sites like that. And that's all it'll take, mulch and water.
Yeah. I have a little thing about it, and some of my students will know this, is get them to get their hands together like this and go, This is Zen in arboriculture. Okay, if you can just do this, and stands for organic matter. If we can get the organic matter down and we can get some water in, we're mostly the way there. And I have a phrase for it, and the phrase is this: everything a tree needs to be a tree is found in a tree. We don't eat people, that's just not on. But trees, fortunately, can benefit from other trees that are cut down. And we're in an industry where our colleagues are cutting trees down and chopping them up into the perfect size little bits with a nice mix of high carbon, low nitrogen compost, and it can be applied green. I mean, it's just everything. You're sitting there saying, well, why is this? It's not used more. And I have to say, to the credit of Australia, we're probably the best at using arborist chip anywhere in the world. We certainly appreciate the value of it and the value of adding it. So that's my bit on tolerability of tree species. Has anyone else got a question on that? I've got one last little area that I want to go to before we say goodbye for the day. No, any questions on it? Yeah, David? You've got to turn your mic on, Dave.
Yeah.
Yep, gotcha.
Got me?
Yep.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Eucalyptus camaldulensis, they tend to grow in wet sites, along forests, and they like being inundated with water. How do you think they cope with?
I think brilliantly. You can get pretty close to a camaldulensis, and interestingly enough, its kin Pterodocornis, both fairly tolerant of root damage. And I think that in part is because you've got this really important sinker root system, and often on camaldulensis, and I've got a lovely shot that Louise Bennett sent me of a 3-layered system. So it's literally gone down, hit a layer of soil that's held more moisture, grown more rapidly than that, done the same thing 3 times.
Okay.
Again, look at it beside a riverbank when it's washed out, and you'd be amazed at what's not there on the surface.
Yes.
There's often and there's not saying there's not roots there, but again, that's one of those trees that has huge number of first order lateral roots. They're not all at the surface, but if you look at the layers, they're there in huge numbers. And you see that when you do and reach down your end of the way, there's a Radgery goanna tree on the river in Albury, and it was carved about 40 odd years ago, and it's completely occluded, and it's a good Coulomon sized scar. That just shows you how quickly they can close up. I also went out to a project out the other side of Hay for looking at a scar tree, and I asked the councillor if they had any shots of the bridge being built in the 1950s, and they came back with a shot that showed the tree not there at all, and yet it was almost a metre in diameter. And you sit there and think, wow, that is a tree that has immense vigour and adapts with dry, because you see them in areas where it just dries out incredibly, and yet you see them completely flooded. So that would be a tree I'd feel comfortable with coming in closer than 12 times trunk diameter. I'd probably be happy with 3 times trunk diameter on one side, with just nothing more than a little bit of water added and some organic material.
Despite being evergreen, would you still try and tackle that during its, try and catch it in a dormant period?
Oh yes, I love you, Reese. Again, trying to pick the prime time is always desirable. There are some dilemmas with that. One of the dilemmas with that is oftentimes developers don't want to hold back. But if that was the difference between the deal going ahead and the deal not, there are lots of things you can do. So I'm looking at a childcare centre at the moment. They're probably not going to build until next year, but we'll be doing rip pruning this winter on the eucalypts, just so that they're prepared and ready to go. Mm. And if you do that sort of thing, one of the things to keep in mind is putting in some form of barrier to deflect the roots back from the construction zone. Otherwise, they will grow new roots back into that construction zone, and then you go and cut them off again. And I see that as being incredibly cruel. So where you dig through and trench through, just a temporary barrier is all that. It doesn't need anything sexy or great, or we use sarking and just sarking.
It's only got to do 12 months kind of thing, because
that's right. Yeah. I want it to then occupy that soil. I want that sarking to come out when they go to the construction stage. It's the same process we use with transplanting. When we get the preparation time, and so that in most cases we don't get preparation time. Okay, well, I thought about something today as I was driving along, and I've got Danielle's going to answer some questions for me and turn on a mic and talk to me for a few minutes. But we've talked about reports being readable. That is, the grammar being good, the English being good, sentence structure, flow, things being in the right spot. We've spent a fair bit of time talking about that. Well, I thought the issue with reports is to do with the 3 R's. You all know what the 3 R's are. It's got to be readable, it's got to be relevant, and it's got to be reliable. Okay? Readable, relevant, and reliable. The relevant is, you don't want to put everything in there, and you want to make sure that what you put in there is relevant to what the matter you're dealing with. And oh boy, I think we've all seen Arborist reports where there's 30 pages of stuff that's just thrown in there that just isn't needed. So, a 4-page excerpt on camaldulensis from a eucalyptus book to tell you about it. Oh, it's Eucalyptus comargelensis. That's what we want to know. And this is a species that grows in riparian zones and is relatively tolerant to root damage or whatever you want to put in there. And that last bit is the reliable bit, and that is making sure that your information is accurate. And I always feel like a fraud with these discussion things, because I realize how little we know about arboriculture and how much arboriculture is developing and growing. And often what we bring to the table is a lot of biases and a lot of our own perceptions, but also a lot of the biases are what we're taught. And again, I was down in Melbourne last week, and I made some comment about using green mulch, and I was just thinking that they were going to probably take me out and stone me at that point of time. And I had to say, no, well, there has actually been research that has shown that green mulch is better than composted mulch for adding around trees. And for those of you who want to go read on that, if you go to, I think it's Horticultural Myths or Tree Myths, Linda Chalker-Scott is the author, anyhow. She has a site on myths. So if you type in Linda Chalker-Scott and myths, you'll see she's got a large number of them there, including things like, do the decompactor blower things, the terralift type things work well? And, how about a mycorrhizal inoculum and those sort of things. So when it came to relevant, I had a student, Danielle, are you there?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, I had a student once hand in an assignment, and it had a whole pile of stuff on Cumberland Plains woodland. And whilst I didn't necessarily agree with her conclusions on Cumberland Plains woodland, I didn't know why it was even in the report. And I knocked 10 points off. And at that point in time, I started removing the daggers from my back and thought, boy, I better be careful about ever doing that again. But the point I had, and we raised and discussed this quite a bit, didn't we, Danny, at the time? I said, somebody's got to pay for that. Who's paying for the 2 or 3 hours for you to write that, develop that? And then if it's not relevant to the actual crux of what you're talking about, why is it in the body of the report? Why is it not in the appendix? Now, your job roles just changed for a period of time, and you're now doing the arboricultural impact assessment reports. Is that right?
Yeah, reading them and deciphering them and being the consent authority to say yes or no.
When you say deciphering them, that's an interesting word to use of a report that's readable.
Yes.
So explain what you mean when you say deciphering.
Just the other day, I had to read a report that actually took me 3 hours to decipher what the author was actually trying to communicate, what they wanted for the property, what the owners of the property needed. I actually had to have a break in the middle of it because I was so confused. It wasn't clear and concise at all. So
clear and concise is something
Yes.
that make a difference. So what things would you want to see, and I'm putting on the spot here, what things would you want to see communicated clearly and concisely for an arboriculture impact assessment report?
The summary at the beginning stating what trees that were to be removed, what trees were to be retained, basically, because that's the first and foremost thing that we look at being a council officer.
Okay, so the proposed trees for retention and removal.
Yes.
What else?
A clear and concise plan, tree management plan, outlining your hold points, where you need a project arborist on site. I'm going, sometimes the reports actually don't even have that in there at all. So we actually don't know what they're expecting post approval.
Yeah, look, and it's the same. I just looked at one this afternoon. I think we were talking on the phone at the time, and I got there and I've got a court approved development. So the court's the consent authority. There's no tree protection plan. And the client's saying, well, I need to get the tree protection in. I'm saying, well, you don't even have a tree protection plan yet. You don't know where, I don't know what you want to put where. And I know I can remove the callistemon, but there isn't a callistemon on the site. And there's 4 trees that you don't have approval to remove on that haven't been shown on the plans. And so there's critical stuff that's left out. Have you come across that yet?
Well, Definitely. If we don't have the schematics for the TPZ and SRZ, I can't make approval on it because I've got none of that information. And we actually had an arborist ring us and said, well, you're qualified arborist. Can't you just determine that and figure that out yourself? No, that's what the client's actually paying you for.
It's an interesting question, though. You could do that. And I see it happen. I mean, I think we've all seen situations where the consent authorities looked at it and said, yeah, okay. And then they write a whole pile of conditions. And I can think of one council in my area that writes it. And I have this process of using trunk guard, which is styrofoam bonded to plywood. And they replace that with using hessian wrapped around the trunk and 4x2s with hoop strapping screwed on. And I sit there and think, why do you downgrade it every time? And that's because they've got standard clauses. And the reason they've got standard clauses is because they're getting these reports that don't have what they want. So they say it's easier for us just to add our clauses in. Would that be a fair comment?
Oh, definitely. I'm going, it's just a standard condition of consent from council. I'm going, if you're not providing enough information to us, we're not mind readers. So we're just doing a blanket statement back saying this is what we expect as part of the Australian standard.
So a good report would give you a set of specifications that you could actually condition.
Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah. And what sort of things would you like that to cover, given a lot of things we've been discussing?
Well, it's also outlining whether a tree is on a council property or whether it's on the actual property that's being developed, because I'm going, the condition of consent for council trees are entirely different to what would be on a private property tree as well. So we need that broken down in that, whether a tree has to be crown lifted, any formative pruning has to be done, basic things like that.
Yeah, okay. And it's interesting you talk about trees on council property. Those of you who see one of my reports, I have every tree that's not on the client's property with an N number, N meaning a tree on a neighbouring property, because there's a legal difference between them. What they do in making a mistake to their own tree is very different than if you make a mistake to a council's tree. And I hear rumour that there may be a Section 95 action against a tree pruning organisation and a householder for malicious damage to property that is being started at the moment. So if that does run, that could be very exciting. So Section 95 in New South Wales is a breach of the Crimes Act, malicious damage to property not otherwise herewith mentioned in the Act. And that would cover mistreatment of a tree. So that may come up in the next 3 to 6 months, which would be good. So anyone else got a question for Danny, and put her on the spot, make them as hard as possible, Reese?
I'm all out now, I'm afraid.
Excellent, thanks, Reese.
Can I ask what council you work for?
Blacktown City.
Okay, and do you have conditions for the Arborist reports on your documents on your website that if you're writing it?
We're in the process of putting that all together. We're having our DCP amended hopefully this year. That'll be pushed through, and that's something that another colleague and I are in the process of sitting down to do, saying this is what the level of expectation is. You must meet X, Y, and Z criteria for your Arborist report actually to be even reviewed as part of the development application.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. Every time I write a report, I go to the council website and look for that to make sure I comply. Yeah.
Well, it's only been in the last few years that the actual Arborist reports have come to the Arboricultural unit. Before, they were all handed by the development unit. So they actually were never aware of what they were looking at, and were just approving trees to be removed.
Okay, wow, yeah.
So we are making changes.
As your arboricultural unit, are you now in good contact with planning? I mean, it's one of my pet frustrations where you go to a property and a plan's already be approved and they say you need to retain the trees. And I'm like, yes, but council's already approved the connection to sewer that just rips straight through this tree kind of thing. Is that?
Yeah, communication has improved exponentially over the past couple of years, and it's something that we're still working on continuously, because if we get a new surveyor that comes in, or an undergrad student and things like that that aren't quite clear on the process, So we're opening up communication saying just call us at any time, email us, asking us a quick question due to that fact, because stamp plans override anything that we can actually say post comment. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it happens to me in a TAFE environment where suddenly a building gets put in or a tree gets cut down. I'm like, we have an ARB department. Why do you never consult us on these things? It's, yep.
Yeah. And it is about getting trees known as an asset. And that's something that we work hard on every single day, that it's not just a building that's the asset.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, if I can say one thing, yeah, I'm Campbelltown Council. Similar sort of issues, but our arboriculture impact assessments are still sort of being judged by excavator operators, I guess you could say, through the development team. They're still not quite with us, but as I say, even with us, I have a lot of dramas with private certifications. The private developers going, and you get to a site and going, you need to remove a stump of a street tree, and you get there and going, how come the stump's gone? And then the whole block's has been completely annihilated, not a tree left on it. And yeah, I'm in the process of trying to rewrite some of our policies and other things as well. And yes, it's good to know that it's not just my council that has these issues, but yeah, it's across the board. And I think trying to build that network within the council is the big thing, which I'm trying to do at the moment, and trying to find everybody's names and trying to work out where it is and how I can best implement the new strategies to try and improve the processes that go on.
I think there's complying development's a really difficult thing because of these creatures, sub-hominid creatures called certifiers, that, I mean, I'm not saying that they're all bad, but boy, there are some that are atrocious. And I have one of my favorite ones at the moment where the little studio was almost 200 square meters in size. And I'm pretty sure that's not compliant, but it got built and certified. So you sit there and think, how does that happen? I called up a council staff member I know at another council and said, I give up, Scott. And he said, oh, I tell you, you just find the right certifier and you can get anything certified.
Yeah.
And so there's a point to which they're going through that stage of development that perhaps we as arborists were going through maybe a decade ago, where, you know, it was write a arborist report and, you know, people were out there writing an arborist report based on what the client wanted rather than based on the last point, which is reliable. What's accurate information? You know, what do you really have to bring that's truthful in this situation? And I think we've got to be careful as arborists not to become an advocate for the client, but to remain an advocate for the trees. And I think that's a hard position for some in the industry to hold. And for the sake of it, I'll be honest, I don't think it's got anything to do with you do tree work or not. I think it's just to do with who you are as a person. Some people will stay in solid and some people won't. I have one for you, Danny, and Luke, you too. There seems to be sometimes an us and them mentality in New South Wales. Victoria seems to have a lot more cohesive industry between industry and local government. What do you think industry and local government could do together to better help each half work to the same common goals?
I think it's like Vicky was saying, just have a breakdown basically on our website of what the level of expectation is. Just open that line of communication, potentially have little mini conferences and or arrange meetings between city councils and the greater community of the ARB industry about what you think should be a requirement, because it's like you're saying, you shouldn't have to put things into a report that aren't necessary, that you're just wasting your time writing and charging an individual for. And I'm going, and then that way we're able to communicate back to the consultant that we actually don't need to see any of that information. So I think it might be where we just have little mini conferences and discuss that and open it up.
I don't know how others would feel, but it'd be really nice to see when people talk about this is the way they want or this is what they want in a report, is to see some sort of a hypothetical pro forma or exemplar of a report. So it's one thing to say, provide arboricultural reasons for the removal of a tree. And I know that several councils have that clause in their thing. And I'm thinking, I can't think of an arboricultural reason to remove a tree. I can think of safety reasons to remove a tree. But trees are able to fall down quite happily all by themselves. They don't need us to do that. They can die all by themselves. They can do everything by themselves. And so I sometimes say the other side, I can't find an arboricultural reason to do this at all. But is that what you really mean? Or did you mean, from an arborist perspective, provide some rationale? And again, I find it difficult because I'm saying it's not my job to support or reject development. My job's just to demonstrate that trees remain viable or give an opinion that the tree won't.
I think on my point, council needs clear guidelines and clear structure of their expectations, and their expectations need to be, as an arborist writing a report, as going into court, you're meant to be non-biased, so not be for or against. What council needs to see is the clear cut, what is wrong with the tree, why should it get done, whether it be a QTRA or another thing, the targets, and have a reason, not just because it drops some leaves or fruit or I don't like it, it's blocking out my solar power panels. With council needs to be clear guidelines as to why. And I believe the arborist's job in a report is to clearly state the species, what it is, endemic, does it have any heritage, any other benefit, habitat, and if it's none of them, if it has a target and the reasons why this tree should be removed or this tree should be retained. They can have an opinion, I believe, but I believe it's still sort of council's objective at the end of the day to what their guidelines are, but it needs to be clear cut of what the intention is.
Yeah, look, and there's the other side to that. And I was speaking to another arborist, I don't know whether Phil's online, Phil Whitten, this afternoon about it. And I got called out to a site where the council had said no. And the council said, however, we'll review the situation if we get an arborist report. And I got there and I said, I can write an arborist report and the arborist report's going to say the council's assessment was correct. And they said, but no, I need an arborist report to say the tree is going to go. And I said, the problem here is that's not being communicated to you. And so one of the feedbacks I'd give to local government would be there's a need to really make some time to revise the communications you put out to the ratepayers when you do a rejection or when you seek for further information, to communicate better what you are trying to get. So if it's, we'll review the situation of an AQF level 5 arborist can find a major factor, failure factor that's been missed by the council, another reason why the tree should be moved, whatever it might be, rather than just provide an arborist report. Because there's almost this concept that from ratepayers that once they've got me back out there and they've given me that money, I'm going to somewhere or other give them this magical document that I give to you, Luke, and you become hypnotized by it and you say, remove tree. Remove. Is anyone else go through that? Peter, up in your end of the world, do you go through that?
Yeah, it's interesting listening to people from these other LGAs because, I don't know, certainly some of the local LGAs here are a bit further down the track and, not only do have requirements for an arborist report clearly in their documents, but also have a planning system where they have a tree person. Sometimes it's not actually an arborist, it's more likely to be somebody with an ecological background to review the reports and to make those decisions. And so certainly in at least half of the local LGAs, I don't see these problems because, 10 years ago we did. And
10 years ago you had nothing. I mean, it's gone so much Sure.
Well, it's a little bit more than 10 years ago that we had nothing.
Right, it's not that long ago.
But, you know, certainly the engineer or, you know, the people that were making the determinations didn't know anything about trees. And I mean, if you think back a little bit further, I remember having conversations 20 odd years ago where you had a tree problem and the only question was, well, how big a bulldozer do we need then? And so, you know, it's changed a lot, and there have been some, particularly in the Byron and Tweed local government areas, there have been a number of council staff who have put a lot of time and effort into thinking about these things and producing these policy documents, which now are, in my view, producing better results, both for the trees and for people who want to develop.
Excellent.
I mean, I'm still in an LGA with an adjacent LGA that has zero local tree protection.
Yeah, and there are
Just nothing.
some here too. Certainly, as you go a bit away from the coast, then they just don't have anything.
Yeah.
I think it's just about managing clients' expectations, and I'm very blunt and very honest with them. And I just say, I'm going to provide a report that's factual in nature, dealing with the Australian guidelines, making sure you're compliant with council. And people, my clients are starting to say to me that I haven't spoken to anyone that's as direct as I am. I said, you're not necessarily going to get the outcome that you're looking for because it's all science-based. And I have to make sure that I write something that if it were to be challenged somewhere, that I could justify why I'd written what I'd written. And I think it's about, I say again, managing clients' expectations and educating them, because I think there's not enough education around what clients think they want and what they actually are going to receive.
Yes, and I think that's a part of that communication, Jan, that I was saying. It would be good if the consent authorities communicated their past back to the industry with greater precision than saying you need an arborist report. Good. It really should be an arborist report that achieves some set of parameters. And, you know, my comment when I go back to clients in that situation, it was the other day, is, well, you're paying me to tell you the truth. And so at least you know what the council did was a good inspection and what they've said is accurate and valid. And that's about all I can say. But it would be nice if I didn't have to correct that error of, no, I'm not here to give you that magical report. It'd be nice if the council had said, look, you're probably not going to find some evidence to the contrary, but if you do, and you can get an AQF level 5 arborist to present that report, we'll review that situation.
I guess with our council, we've got the tree over 10 metres, like most councils have, DBH over 200, where they start to become trees where they specify arborist report within their applications. That's more so because once they sort of get to that height, they start becoming like the amenity value of the tree within areas, and they start becoming part of the landscape. So instead of just having, I guess, a biased opinion of council, I guess they sort of put it to go, well, we want a little bit more information so we can make a better informed judgment. And maybe a non-biased judgment. I'm not sure whether that's where they go for it. As I said, I think with my council, there's a lot of policy and documents that need to change, which I'm working on, but I know we do just go, need more information, and we probably don't give the specifics of what information we're actually requiring. And I don't know if we're able to say, oh, we want a Picus test done to make sure and to prove the structural stability. We've got to be careful, I guess, our limitations of what we ask the residents, of course, their rates pays as well. And it's difficult.
That stuff is normally dealt with by a development control, a chapter in a development control plan, which deals with tree preservation and what's required. So it normally talks about when a tree becomes a tree. and what trees are protected and how and where they're protected, and if there are any exemptions to that protection, and what you need to do if a tree is protected and you want to lop top or destroy it, and those sort of things. And that's a document that, yeah, I mean, that's what it's all driven by.
Yeah, look, I think whilst that's correct, it's still that process of communication. And I know that Kelly's listening in there and quite silent, but regularly there's this sort of, where the local government says, no, it doesn't meet the requirements, it's not going to be satisfactory, no. And then it's almost a standard clause that says then, however, if you've got some new evidence, bring it forward and we'll review the situation, which is perfectly fine. But just it's not communicated with the precision of, if you have new information that meets these requirements then. And so there is this tendency, and I would come across at least once a fortnight, where a householder thinks that calling the arborist out is going to change the world, either for the development or for a tree removal or for a litigation process. And that's definitely not the case.
I think as arborists, it's up to us to educate the public, because there's a definite lack of education.
Yeah.
And that's what I would say I'd spend most of my time doing.
I agree, Jan. I think it just needs to, all parties need to play in it. And that's, if the local government had said, look, it must meet these requirements, I wouldn't spend as much time educating them. And there's a point to which I think probably half of my clients would say, well, I'm not even going to bother getting an arborist report because the council are probably right.
So I go to site once we've paid for a VTA, and I say at the end of the VTA, one of two things is going to happen. I'm going to say, based on my experience, it's unlikely that council will approve, or it's likely, would you like to proceed with an arborist report? And then I take the data and walk away with an arborist report or not.
Yeah.
So I always go to site with a paid VTA first. Because I think that's just the honest way to do it. I know I don't know if it's a good business model, but I just can't take money from clients to write arborist report if I know that the outcome that they're looking for is likely not feasible.
I'm on the same process. I say to them, look, I don't think you're going to get consent. I'll give you a set of, because I always give file notes just so that I know what we've talked about and they've got a copy of it. And so it serves our side as well. And then if they want a full-on report, I'll write a full-on report. And I was just saying to Phil Whitten this afternoon, one of the things that I really hate doing is writing that first few paragraphs says the client's concerned about the tree, the client believes it's going to fail, the client wants the tree removed, and then I've done a VTA, there's nothing that suggests the tree is anything else but an average ordinary tree, and I see no reason to support the removal of it. And you can see the conflict is that they still think there's going to be some magic to that level 5 report. And so I would have that happen at least probably 5 or 6 times a year, where I have to sit down and expose the entire scenario in the report, and they still have some getting a yes when I know they're not going to hope in hell.
However, if you've communicated that, that's ultimately their choice.
Yeah, I agree with you. I just always feel it's the same as school tree risk assessments. I start most of those by telling people that he's been rorted by an unnecessary requirement, and that's what I'm here to do. And my superannuation fund thanks him, but morally I feel reprehensible about it. The likelihood that I'm going to find a tree that poses a risk in a school that an 8-year-old hasn't seen is pretty small.
I guess as an inspector as well, like another example of where I guess our statement is broad is at least once a week I get called up to go, trees roots are in my pipes, and I go there, have a look at the tree and go, and that's where I go provide a plumbing report. I don't sort of go to the specifics. I don't go to the specifics of going, I want DNA testing on the tree and send that to a lab, and I want proof that it is that tree. I'm sort of asking for more of a broad, give me some evidence and show me that the tree actually, that is that tree. If it's 5 meters from the house, you can track the camera down and go 5 meters from the house, the roots were found here. Yes, I can sort of say it's that tree, and I'll be happy to do some mitigation work on that. But I guess it's you go and see a tree, it looks perfectly healthy, and you're just going, look, want an arborist report, getting an opinion, and if you want this tree gone, give me some evidence that suggests why I should get it. I'm not going to climb it myself and do a aerial inspection and start sticking rods in my hand in hollows or doing other testing. Like that's for you to do that testing. If you think it's dangerous, prove to me why it's dangerous, and I'll do the inspection, and I'll look at the evidence that you provide me and make my judgment on that. That's more where that broad statement is, I think.
Yeah, look, I agree with that, Luke, and that would be one of the things that, again, I would say local government needs to make clear that in its inspection fee, it's not, or in its application fee, it's not undertaking assessment duties. It's simply reviewing the information provided and undertaking a site visit to verify or falsify it. We've got guys going. It's time for us to all go. So, guys, we'll be back in a month's time. You've seen it. TIPS is coming up in about 3 weeks' time. If you don't know about it, ask Peter about it. And we will do a little bit more on the writing of Arborist reports for this one. And we're going to look at that reliable information. So what information do we have in terms of papers and information on trees and development sites? What sort of references can we use? And I'll give you some source information on that. So I'll see you in a month's time or 3 weeks' time, depending on when you're at.